Yeah, we're good to start.
Yeah.
I'm going to be running a debate keeper, guys, so there'll be bell noises.
Bell noises.
Yeah, you are. Do you not want to be in the frame?
It's okay.
We'll just do a whole video of me eating. We'll deal with that.
That's fine, we are. Human beings eat.
Alright, is everyone ready?
Hmm?
Decapitation techniques intensify radicalization in the worst terrorist organizations, making them more capable of carrying out brutal acts. They also make terrorism more uncontrolled and more dangerous because when you kill a leader, you get infighting and splintering that makes the movement more violent. We'll be forwarding 3 arguments today. First, about how decapitation makes it harder to win the hearts and minds of locals. Second, on how the tactics for decapitation entail more civilian damage. And third, about how this makes terrorism more uncontrolled. But first, the model. First, we would prefer, instead of decapitation, offensive as well as defensive counterterrorism strategies. Offensive means we're happy to have boots on the ground, establishing safe zones in which people can flee from terrorist organizations to weaken them. If there are sudden violations in the zones, if there are terrorists on the border, we're happy to have airstrikes to get rid of them. We're also happy to open negotiations with terrorists to get them to stop fighting. Second, we'd be happy to take a more long-term approach as well, de-radicalization strategies that actually speaks to locals on the ground and convinces them not to join a terrorist organization. On our first argument about how decapitation makes it much harder to win hearts and minds, decapitation intensifies radicalization because it creates martyrs who then are used as powerful symbols and lightning rods to get people to join the movement. First, analyze how terrorist movements are so effective. It is entirely by recruitment, by sheer numbers, and by scale. This is the most important thing. Terrorist organizations don't thrive on wealth. They don't often have a state. They don't often have huge coffers or bank accounts. The way they thrive is by having sheer numbers that can be used as shock absorbers, that can be used as suicide bombers, that can carry out damage on a massive scale. The way that you get people to commit to such a movement, to give up their lives for it, and to get such large numbers of people to commit is entirely by myths and symbolism. Leaders create a symbolism around themselves. They assume a cult-like status. They become almost divine, become like prophets that are associated with God. That is why the martyr effect that happens when you kill a terrorist leader is so much more severe than with any other kind of counterinsurgency terrorist strategy. When you kill a regular civilian in a terrorist area or a regular terrorist, it's just seen as murder. But when you kill a terrorist leader, it is seen as profane, akin to killing the Prophet Muhammad himself in some areas that genuinely believe that Baghdadi was to be a savior or a second prophet. It is akin to blowing up a mosque for these local populations. You have killed the entire reason for joining this movement. This doesn't make them weaker. This only makes them stronger, because remember, these are people who are willing to fight and die for this leader. They are certainly willing to fight and die for him once you've killed him. The impact of this is used very effectively for recruitment. The remaining terrorist leaders now use this as propaganda to get more people to join the movement. Say, look at what this Western government did, look at what the Saudi government did to your leader. You have got to take up arms, employ even more brutal force. That is when terrorism becomes more brutal. The counterfactual is that we prefer a de-radicalization strategy that doesn't antagonize locals in such a vehement way, right? But rather approaches them through, for instance, giving them like services that they might prefer. Recognize also that while you intensify radicalization, you don't actually do anything to weaken the movement, right? Which is what I think opposition is going to say. Because terrorist movements, because of their sheer numbers, have got a large line of successors who've been trying for years to take over in the event that this guy's decapitated. Remember also that they're prepared for the prospect of assassination. I think Baghdadi knew he would be assassinated at some point in the future, and that's why he prepared successors. So there's a chain of command to take over. You don't cripple the organization at all. You only make them stronger. Our second argument is about how these tactics that are often used with decapitation often entail, hold on a minute, more civilian damage, and this makes radicalization worse. But before that,
how do you help get rid of the halo effect around Baghdadi by explicitly saying he's untouchable and should not be killed?
We're not saying he should not be killed. We think we much rather change the hearts and minds of people by saying that there is nothing special about Baghdadi. That happens when you provide them the services and things that Baghdadi provided them. When you kill Baghdadi, you only intensify that halo effect because he forever will remain relegated to the realm of the divine, of the untouchable. When you kill someone, you make them a martyr, you make them immortal in a way. Our second argument, tactics for decapitation lead to more civilian deaths. the tactics used for decapitation are skewed and become more reckless because decapitation skews decision-making of these governments and these politicians in a very dangerous way for two main reasons. First, there's much higher political willingness of, for instance, the US government to undertake high-risk and highly dangerous military strategies with decapitation, because the potential gain, the potential boon to a US president's career for killing a terrorist leader like Osama bin Laden is so huge that they're willing to take almost any degree of risk, sacrifice as many civilian lives as they want, use as brutal military tactics as they want, because they justify it on the grounds that we're killing evil incarnate. This leads to a really skewed decision-making mechanism that leads to them to taking really brutal actions. The second reason why it skews decision-making is because what you have to lose to decapitation strategies is not that great. Recognize that the individuals that you send in for decapitation missions are often highly trained Navy SEALs who the public is more okay with dying because they see them as having signed up for this mission. The comparative is our strategy of boots on the ground. When you're sending in a regular kid from the Bronx, a regular foot soldier, when they die in masses, the public is much more angry about it. That's why the president's much more willing to sacrifice the lives of people they send on these elite missions than on the missions that we advocate for instead. What this means is that you justify really brutal decision making in two ways, right? Sorry, you justify really brutal decision making. This means that they're more willing to use airstrikes, to use choppers, and to use lethal force without necessarily verifying whether, for instance, this house really is the house of Osama. You're just going to bomb it and then check afterwards because what you have to gain is so great. This leads to two impacts. First, it radicalizes local populations more because it's much more likely that you lead to civilian deaths. Also, in the process of decapitation, you often kill the wives, the women, the children that live with this terrorist. That leads to local populations seeing the foreign government as being especially brutal, and therefore it's okay to fight back with even more force against them. This is how wars become more brutal. But the second impact is that terrorist leaders know that the government will deliberately target them in this way, so they hide among civilian populations, right? But this only leads to the scale of damage being greater on decapitation missions, because given that the governments have got less consideration for civilian damage on these kinds of missions, there's more willingness to kill civilians, and that leads to radicalization among the populations that have been disrupted because of this mission. Therefore, you only lead to more radicalization, you also lead to more civilian deaths, and I think that wars becoming more brutal because of this strategy is just a bad thing. It escalates it unnecessarily. Our final argument is about how this makes terrorism more uncontrolled and more dangerous. The counterfactual, the comparative is this. In our world, you have a unified movement under one leader. He might continue to exist, but at least he keeps the movement together. In their world, when you kill the leader, there's immediately a power vacuum, splinters form within a movement, and there's infighting, vying among different leaders to fill the power vacuum. When this happens, two things. First, less willingness to negotiate with governments, because you're less to gain when you're an individual leader among 10 than when you're one leader like Baghdadi who might gain power sharing. But second, it leads to more infighting, and violence goes up because these disparate groups try to vie with each other to out-compete each other, and that's when you get the worst forms of warfare. We're very proud to propose.
Okay, hello.
Yeah, it's a contribution.
I need to sort it out even before
I know
put
there's
it
a
out.
contribution, don't worry.
Mr. Speaker, the reason why we think we win is because opening government is fundamentally contradictory in that case. I'm not sure why yet, but we have to tell you why. Here's what I think the problem is. The problem is that the war on terror is one that we structurally find it difficult to win. It is a war with high stakes because of the images of the fact that people die, the images of the Twin Towers crashing to the ground. The problem is that creates a world of high fear among individuals who should have no reason to fear. The problem is that they feel that they are always on the defensive. They are on the defensive against a shadowy enemy who they don't know who the enemy is, and they don't know where the enemy will strike. Because the only way that you can defend yourself on that side is to try to weed out the individual terror cell or the individual terror operative at the point that he comes to your borders. What we suggest is that the strategy of decapitation is the only way in which can reasonably be offensive against these terror groups, and that is why we propose. I want to be very clear on what we don't defend. One, I don't think we defend unstrategic assassination. So when they talk about negotiations, I know it is a case that assassinating a Taliban leader made it more difficult to negotiate. That is a stupid assassination that we don't need to defend on our side. Second, we also don't need to defend unspecific and botched assassinations. One, because the motion clearly doesn't suggest that's the case. But two, also because it's just unlikely that these are going to happen for the exact same reasons that they characterize. One, drones create a high amount of international outrage. I'm not sure that countries necessarily want that to happen. But two, governments themselves know that hearts and minds are important to win in the war on terror. So I don't understand why they would enter assassinations that necessarily lead to high civilian casualties if Colin herself can tell us that everybody knows this is the bad thing for the government. The third important thing to note is that this is not the only way to defeat terrorist organizations. But we think it's an important option in the range of ways in which we want to deal with terror organizations. In other words, everything they say about de-radicalization programs, I think we can do as well. Core argumentation on why we think this is an effective way to take out terrorist leaders. And within this, I'm going to deal with the argumentation that they give you. The first thing they tell you is this idea on hearts and minds. The first thing I want to note is that the concept of martyrdom is inherent to terror groups. I don't understand why having one martyr over another martyr will necessarily make the terror group significantly harder to deal with. But note importantly, right, that their offensive operations create more martyrs, presumably, because more people within the terror groups die. Why is it that these individuals are equally effective martyrs, if not more so? The reason for that is that as foot soldiers, at the point that you join a terror group, right, you are not likely to become the highest person in the organization because the American dream doesn't work in a terror group. The reality is that for these individuals, the kind of martyrdom that they're sold is the individual who gives up their life fighting for the cause, the individual who succeeds in a terror bombing and therefore is glorified. And that particular individual is going to be relatable on both sides of the house. So there's just no delta on that side as to why they're going to create significantly more effect in being able to deal with these terror groups. The second thing they say is they thought Baghdadi was the prophet, and so you kill Baghdadi is like you kill the prophet. This is absolutely bizarre because it's unclear to me how that de-radicalization programs are going to successfully change the minds of individuals who think that Baghdadi is their prophet. What is more likely to be the concept of hearts and minds? It is that individuals unlikely to underground, who presumably are moderate enough that you can win them over, are unlikely to be ideological in the first place. It is their offensive operations which they resort to that structurally create more civilian deaths. Because it's incredibly unclear to me how they think there's less civilian deaths when you have actual boots on the ground than targeted surgical strikes on leaders. And so on that side of the house, it is more likely that innocent individuals with no connection to the terror group are get caught in the crossfire, have their lives affected by your offensive operations. And that's when you lose hearts and minds significantly more, Mr. Speaker. The second thing we say is this idea of the decision-making calculus of the political group. There are two responses. The first is that the comparative on our side is that people are less likely to die in targeted assassinations. One, because they're more elite, but two, because it's less likely to meet widespread opposition. But the second important thing to know is that on that side of the house, their mechanisms of boots on the ground work against their argumentation. And the reason for that is that at the point that you have wide-scale boots on the ground operations, you are more likely to have people die because there's just more people and more chance of this happening, but also because there are likely to be less trained troops. The effect of this is that on that side of the house, when these individuals die, you increase the level of radicalism at home and antagonism that says that we have to take more action against these terror groups. That means that the likelihood of more people dying and therefore a larger circle of violence on that side is significantly greater. Why do we think that we are effective in taking out terror groups? We'll deal with the rest of what they have to say. The first important reason is that we break the ideology from that side. The thing is that these terror groups, more often than not, the core individuals, the leadership of the terror group is also the people who have the most rhetorical power in taking out, in spreading the ideology of the terror group. I'll take you in a bit. At the point that we're able to take them out, we take out the most powerful and most inspiring rhetoric that can happen from these terrorist groups. That means that if it's about other hearts and minds, at the point that we're able to blunt the effectiveness of their rhetoric, that is a win. But the second important reason why we take out their ability to grow as an organization is because we break the halo effect that exists around these groups, right? The problem on that side of the house is that at the point that these individuals are able to continually show their face in broadcast and keep spreading their message, that is a show of strength. That show of strength inspires people to join a group that they believe will be successful because they believe that there's actually tangible end goals at the end of it. And that's why when ISIS was the first terror group to hold territory, that's why there were so many more foreign recruits that were willing to join ISIS. We break this at the point that we show that this doesn't work because we show the weakness of this terror group at the point that we're able to attack them. Yes.
Baghdadi's name is known in every household in ISIS territory. The kind of personal outrage you provoke is far greater than when a random farmer from Idlib dies.
Right.
Can you explain how you uniquely deal with the resentment that you create?
Right, there are two important responses here. The first is, I think Baghdadi's, to the extent that Baghdadi's name is known and presumably revered, it is completely unclear to me why they don't also already hate the United States of America and hate the West. But the second argument is, I posit the farmer in Idlib will be angrier if his wife dies in the American attack than if his like prophet dies, right? That's the first. So to that degree, the second argument we have is on this idea of breaking the hierarchy, and this is something that they tell you, but they don't actually give you clear analysis of why this is a bad thing. There are two important analyses why we think it's a good thing to break these hierarchies. The first thing to note is that at the point that they fight one another, that is a good thing, because that presumably limits the extent to which they can spend their power fighting us, like intuitively. But the second important analysis is that on that side, if you splinter them up, it is significantly harder for them to have the degree of expertise needed to carry out successful, large-scale attacks like the 911 operations. We think that the effect of this is that if we are able to blunt the force of these terrorist groups by making them significantly more disparate, then I think that's a win for our side. Their argument was negotiation. I presumably wouldn't attack individuals who are willing to negotiate. Therefore, I don't think that's part of the debate. The second analysis is that this is important and necessary to the war on terror as a whole. The problem is that at the point that your enemy is just shadowy and difficult to identify, that's a morale sink for individuals who are not able to feel that they are being successful within the war. The comparative on our side is that at the point where these practical targets, this is incredibly important to boosting morale on the home front. That's why Osama's death was celebrated in the US as a victory. Why is this important? Two reasons. The first is that if you don't have this morale, terrorists win because they're able to create a climate of fear that forces people to change the way they operate. But the second thing that we do is that we prevent knee-jerk reactions like the Muslim ban, and at the point we allow people to feel some degree of success in the war against terror. We're very happy to oppose.
One moment. Okay, Oxford A.
So I'm going to talk to you about two things, right? I'm going to first show our comparative win on radicalization. And second, I think where we more clearly win is our definite win on negotiation and harm reduction. So first, the very muddy clash on radicalization. Sean says, we don't need to defend bad assassination. This is bad debating. Because the structural characteristics of your method change your analysis of good and bad. The notion of bad depends on the incentive structure that decapitation creates. So when he says things like drones create international outrage, that's the fucking point. Do you think Obama cares about international outrage? Because the fucking farmer in Pakistan's not going to be voting for Obama or Trump. That's exactly what creates an incentive for these US presidents to use drone strikes to decapitate in the first place. That actually feeds into Colin's argument. Because if you have to send boots on the ground for a long operation, that increases the catalyzation effect, the obstacle to act in the first place, meaning that on our side, people intervene less often, leading to less harms, whereas on their side, there is the intolerable and constant drone of human suffering as a consequence of the low political cost. So we argue, contra Sean, that the notion of bad changes when you change the method. So that misses the case, yeah? Second, Sean says, martyrdom. There's no delta, because individuals are more relatable. Look, there are different kinds of martyrdom. This is not a unitary spectrum. It is not like 10 dead farmers equals to 1 dead leader. These are two different kinds of martyrdom. I can relate to the dead farmer at the same time as I am outraged by the fact that Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi dies. This is a difference in type and not a difference in degree. And the reason why this martyrdom is so important is because even though on both sides, terrorists will still be angry, a surge of anger at a particular time creates a surge in violence that is harder for governments to defend against. Because if we hold capabilities constant on either side, a sudden surge in violence makes it very difficult for a government to then be able to deploy troops any given time, given that this surge can tend to be unpredictable. That's exactly how the Viet Cong was able to defeat the US forces, by ensuring that individual actions of the leaders being killed suddenly led to a surge in guerrilla violence, because it changed the amount that individuals were willing to sacrifice in order to see the deed done. So, for example, maybe right now as a farmer, what I'm doing is that I'm providing food and grain to the terrorist fighters. You kill Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, now I'm willing to die. Now I'm willing to make sure that my daughter dies as well alongside me to mislead the government forces. That is the delta. On neither side do we defeat the Taliban. No team, okay, will prove today that they win the war on terror. It is a war that nobody can win, but we at least mitigate the violence. That's the important difference. Then Sean says, civilian deaths. You have to prove to me why boots on the ground have fewer deaths. 3 reasons why. First, as I've already shown you, there is a higher political cost to putting boots on the ground, especially because in order to have a successful operation, these units need to comprise people who are considered average Joes, like your random guy from the Bronx. And the public is going to be really outraged if you're going to have many of these operations at the same time. So you only intervene when the stakes are fairly high and you're fairly certain that they will succeed. You don't want to have another Mogadishu. Second, there is an incentive to gather longer-term information from people on the ground when you have a long-running military operation, as opposed to drone strikes where variable information can be used even if you don't have a high degree of certainty. That is why when the US was targeting Osama bin Laden, they were perfectly fine killing an Iraqi sheep herd who was 6'4" because all they had to go on was that Osama bin Laden was tall. And the reason why they could do this was because the cost to America of doing this was fairly low relative to the potential benefit of killing Osama. That's why Colin's material matters in this debate. Third reason why we have fewer civilian deaths, because the establishment of services as a consequence of having more boots on the ground operation also mean that individuals have greater incentive to defect rather than to stay with terrorist organizations, meaning that you deprive terrorist organizations of a very important source of manpower and resources. And I think that's a comparative win for death. Okay, next. Then Sean says, you need to prove that you don't also increase radicalization back home in the US. I don't need to rebut this because this argument is hung on proving the practical effects of decapitation. So he has hung the argument of increasing radicalization back home on proving his case. So actually, this argument is a wash, alright? Last thing, about this whole idea of breaking the halo effect. I think the image that Colin gives is really important, right? You don't break the halo effect of a religious object by pissing on it or destroying it. You probably incentivize people to treat it even more in terms of reverence and treat it even more in terms of the profanity of the action. And the reason why is this. Proving that something that you have connected to the divine is temporal, like dragging someone who claims to be the Pope down onto the human plane and then torturing him, does not make people then think, oh, he can't be divine, he must be made of flesh. Because that connection is not made. People's prior is already that he is divine. So tackling the physical object doesn't make them then associate the physical object with the temporal. It makes people associate that action with the profane, with the vulgar. And that's what creates anger. So you don't break the halo, you piss on it, and then you piss off the people who respect it. But before I go on, yes.
So your argument is people are devout to the extent that in the status quo you give them some money and some infrastructure from the US and they will defect. But these people also magically, the moment Baghdadi dies, will be so devout that they will put their life against the US.
Obviously there are different groups, right? But we think on the comparative is this. No. The comparative is this, okay? Average person isn't likely to defect on either side, okay? But average person is more likely to defect when you don't kill Baghdadi and you provide services. Average person is more likely to become a terrorist when you kill Baghdadi and you don't provide services. We aren't saying this characterizes all people, we are saying that there is a comparative harm here, right? So I think that POI just doesn't do anything for your case. Next, on negotiation and harm reduction. Now I know what they're going to say. There is a contradiction. Because on one hand you say, there is a long line of successes, but on the other hand you say, there's a power back. Hey, fuck lah. You really think that the USA is going to go down the chain of command and go, okay, we kill number one, then we kill number two, then we kill number three? That's not how it happens. And terrorist organizations know that. So because they never know which point on this hierarchy you're going to kill, the line of succession that they've prepared always have backups. And that's really important. That's what Colin says, right? This long line, at the point at which your central leader, the one who's orchestrating all of this, goes out of the picture, the backups that you have prepared vie within themselves for power and influence within the organization. And that's how we deal with Sean's rebuttal. Sean says we need to keep them occupied fighting each other. The way they fight each other is by bombing Americans. Because by pulling off the bigger attack, by having the most casualties, that's how you get the most recruits to your side. It is a signal of comparative effectiveness. So inner fighting is demonstrated by outfighting. That is the signaling mechanism that Cole talked to you about that was not rebutted. Last of all, on this whole thing about negotiation, yeah, of course, if the war was perfect and we had perfect information, we wouldn't do bad assassinations. But as Cole told you, we don't have this perfect information. So we should err on the side of caution in the same way we have strict liability laws on gun control. For all these reasons, I am incredibly proud to propose.
it's very convenient on OG to be like, here are a bunch of strategies that we think are important, but you know what, winning the war on terror is not the end goal anyway, so who cares? Let's make some things very clear, and we're going to do two things in this speech. One, what is the government's end goal with just being in the war against terror, and what is the end goal for a government to even be engaged in that war in the first place? Two, why is taking out leaders important to those end goals? Before that, a couple of things. The first thing is, it is unclear in opening government what their long game is. Just fight forever, like ever and ever, in perpetuity, we will just keep fighting because that's just the end goal that we want. Here's the deal. If their case is, we don't want splintering because for some reason making terrorist groups smaller is bad, we think that then any win on the war on terror is going to create the same surge, the same unpredictable action, the same ability for people to rise up in anger. It is unclear why this is exclusive to the taking out of terrorist leaders. In fact, any victory that you get in the war against terror will create the same outcomes. But the second thing is this concept of splintering causing infighting and infighting causing violence. We are inclined to say in opening opposition that the one way to destroy a terrorist organization is to let them do it to each other. To be able to say, you know what, there are multiple backups, as he says, to these leaders. They all want to be the person at the top of the organization. Let them duke it out. They will probably end up killing one another, and that is the ideal situation we are in because the terrorist organization crumbles from the inside. We think that's the best case scenario for our war against terror, and if that means we have to help these backup successors along in killing one another, we will do it because that means that the terrorist organization's hierarchy and structure also falls apart. It's unclear why this is a bad strategy if their only outcome is but they will fight one another. The end goal, if you look at a war against terror, is that people are going to die, right? It is unclear why more deaths within the organization is a thing that governments care about. In fact, it's probably a good end goal for them to continue to perpetuate. That every member of the top hierarchy of a terrorist organization probably should die, and that their death is probably not something we care about. The end goal of a government, and this is where we talk about what their reasoning for entering a war against terror is, there are probably two parts. One, the protection and safety of their own citizens. And it's not, as they claim, probably unlikely to be tangible in the short term, but what is more important is the perception of protection and safety of their own citizens. The second is the removal of extremist ideology that affects the way of life that they democratically defend. And it's about getting rid of the ideological back foot that they have. Before that, sure.
So I don't think it really deals with our point of infighting. Because terrorists don't fight each other, they fight the US and they signal to their followers in contesting for the greatest American casualties for internal recruitment.
Yeah, so let's get to in some part of this substantive later about how exactly this fighting will turn out, right? Because the reality is that the power that is held by the person at the top is significantly different to these backup right-hand man options that exist. And the kind of damage they actually can cause to America is significantly lower once the death of that leader is at the top. So this claim that they can actually reach out to America and cause a lot of casualties in return for this kind of harm that is caused to their leader is actually unclear and is not likely to happen. And what is more likely to happen is that they're going to try and win more recruits internally but fail to do that because they no longer have the halo of being the protectors of the people in that region, because even the person who's supposed to be the protector is now dead. Let's look at what this means, right? Why is taking out the leaders important to both of these end goals? The first is the creation of a perception of safety for your citizens, right? When the ideologue holds the power and function on the ground, when OG is right in claiming that Baghdadi's name is known by everyone, it's not just known by everyone in Iraq or Syria, it is also known by most people in the US. The problem with knowing the name of Baghdadi in the US is that it instills fear in saying that your life is a threat on a daily basis across the land. The perception of safety that is lost is by the very logic that OG runs on, that we will fight in perpetuity, our lives are at stake in perpetuity, we will need to keep fighting forever, and there is no viable way to track our progress. In fact, in their world, it is a world where there is just constant fear, where many American troops in Syria and Iraq have to be there because that's the only way you create their policy of your safe zones for fleeing, your de-radicalization, your airstrikes, your open negotiation, all require many large numbers of troops on the ground in these areas. What this does is that you go through the system of back and forth loss and gain in physical territory, right? Today we won certain space, tomorrow we lost it, because you have the individual day-to-day difference between whether or not you're winning the war. The difference with taking out the leader is that it's a guaranteed definite perception of viable progress in the war against terror. That people on the ground at home in the US can say, now we are seeing to be successful, there is maybe a little bit more safety and some sense of relief that I can feel that there is some sort of less likelihood of terrorism on my home ground. We think that that kind of victory is created only when you can kill someone whose name everyone knows. Killing your random person on the ground might not have the same effect in the homeland in terms of creating that perception. The difference is though that the martyrdom effect is significantly less in Iraq and Syria. And this is where we talk about what kind of recruits actually join terrorism. Because let's look at this. Most recruits into terrorism from Iraq and Syria don't join because they feel the ideological connection with Baghdadi and Osama, right? They join because they feel like that's their only form of protection. That people like Baghdadi are going to be their protected savior, that they are the ones who are going to keep them from dying, that they are the ones who are untouchable, and that they are therefore the ones who will make sure that they are safe and taken care of and are the ones who will be protected. That is why they join these groups, because they think their children and their as Chin puts it, their family and their daughter is safe. The problem is that when you take out Baghdadi, you then give them the strong message. Look, they are not your protector. You are not safe behind these leaders. These leaders do not have your welfare at heart and cannot protect you in the same way. This is why we say that a lot of their policy is probably not mutually exclusive from decapitation in the first place. Because you can still have your de-radicalization measures. You can still have your open negotiation. You can still have your welfare packages for the people on the ground. And you do it by saying, hey, look, your leader couldn't protect you because he's dead and died in our hands. We can protect you instead. We think that happens significantly better in our world when we can take out the leader instead of competing with that leader for the same sort of protection status and welfare status. We think that's significantly better than trying to win the war on terror in the long term. Is it going to be something that happens quickly? Of course not. But when you absolutely take out a tool that's available in your shed and say, you know what, there are multiple strategies, this one tool we will never touch, that's when you're saying you're taking one last shot at being able to win the war in the long term. We're not saying that taking out the leader should be the ultimate strategy. And I know that's the case they're running. That because this strategy is available, all leaders will take it first. But obviously, there's backlash to it and they will hurt their own political campaigns by doing it. Because as they claim, if they do it stupidly, there will be ability to hit back at the US that will hurt their own voter base as well. We think that the likelihood is therefore that these strategies will be taken into account to be able to balance all of the outcomes for the individuals that are best in this situation. We oppose.
Previous teams have left an important group out of these debates. The people who get radicalized, the people who have been subjugated to hatred, violence and subjugation to all means of suppression, the reason that they become radicalized, the reason we should care about them, and the way we can change our rhetoric from killing their leaders to change our rhetoric to stopping them from joining these terrorist groups. How we will change that rhetoric, we are the first team we're going to explain to you. We reach both end goals of saving lives right now, of stopping terrorist attacks from right now, and secondly, the long-term goal of making sure that the supply of people getting into these terrorist groups are actually stopped, and hence we win the war on terror. So firstly, why do people join terrorist groups, and how it's an important supply of terrorism, and how killing those leaders wouldn't really solve the problem? Because these terror groups have very efficient bureaucracy. As you see, ISIS taxes people, it has strict laws, and these laws are very well enforced in, for example, ISIS, and hence when you have very efficient bureaucracy and laws and systems, you also have a clear structure on who is going to be the next leader, who is going to be the next caliphate. So it's very unlikely that the groups will splinter up or split into various factions, and hence a new leader might replace them. So what's the new problem? Where are the new leaders coming from? Where are the people getting? The real problem is people being radicalized. How do we solve that? Why do people become radicalized? Take the case of Naga, a northeastern part of India. People are subjugated. Industries come there. Take the land of tribal people. Take the land of tribal people. Don't care about them. Burn the forest. Take their land forcefully, and people are subjugated to such oppression. When countries don't care about the minorities, don't care about certain groups of people, maybe Sunnis don't care about Shias, or Shias don't care about certain minorities. Minorities. That's when people actually get radicalized. And we solve this problem by changing our rhetoric. From changing the rhetoric to we are gonna kill the leader, kill their leader. And Trump's rhetoric, we killed him like a dog. Trump's rhetoric, killing Baghdadi. We're gonna change the rhetoric to now we're gonna care about the minorities. What's our policy? Our policy is caring about the minorities, putting sanctions on these foreign countries to care about these minorities, forcing them, giving another ear to these minorities, so we can listen to them, and hence these people won't get radicalized and cut off the power supply. Is secondly how we care about stopping the terrorist attacks now, because a lot of attention is now on killing these leaders, and a lot of resources are put on killing these leaders. A lot of forces, security forces and intelligence is focused on that. Hence a lot of forces and security doesn't go on stopping the terrorist attacks that are happening right now, and saving the lives that are important, because we try to save people from potential terrorist attacks that might happen in the future by killing these leaders. We do not focus on the immediate threat that is being posed here. The immediate threat we can post here, when we focus the security and every resources to figure out how to stop the immediate terrorist attack that is going to happen here. When we stop the rhetoric of trying to kill this leader and shift the rhetoric to stop the terrorist attack now. Yes, we are.
Why is the public PR pitch about caring for minorities, as we did in attempting democratization in Afghanistan, mutually exclusive from the secret SEAL team mission that took out Osama?
Because when we have the rhetoric of killing these people, villainizing these people are bad. Because as you see Trump's rhetoric, which essentially says that this particular religion is bad, or you take the rhetoric of right-wing Hindu groups in India saying these Naxalites are bad, are inherently bad. This is targeted towards those communities, to those scheduled tribes, and not really solve the inherent problem the way the reason that they get radicalized. Thirdly, it's about how Islamophobia or phobia towards this group that people are getting radicalized from spreads. So when you pass on the rhetoric, when you villainize these people, when you focus on the rhetoric that their leader is bad, its ideology is bad, or rather than on reasons on how to, when you don't care about these minorities, when you don't care about this. When you shift the rhetoric to care about these minorities, caring about these people, to stories of why they became terrorists in the first place, to the stories of what hardships they had to go through, what oppression they had to go through, your fellow Americans, white American Christian citizen is going to see you as a human being, is going to understand your fundamental human nature, where you come from, and why you're probably radicalized. That will reduce the amount of danger and the wall that exists, the barrier that exists in understanding your fellow Muslim. When this wall is broken down, when we try to understand them from a better perspective, to try to understand them from a better perspective, when we push for this rhetoric that we have to care about these minorities, that the reason that they become radicalized, when we focus on that, your fellow Christians, say Christians or Hindus, are able to understand why you are being radicalized and see you as human, and Islamophobia reduces on our end. So I have prove to you why in the long term the essential powers, the essential supply of people being radicalized will be stopped on our side of the house, and secondly, why certain hatred towards this group will be reduced on our side of the house, and why in the long term we will win the war on terror. Have never been traveled to propose.
I think the problem with the opening half of the debate is that you cannot examine decapitation and the cost-benefit analysis of a decapitation strategy in a vacuum. I think it must be weighed against what the likely counterfactual would look like and how the likely counterfactual would likely manifest. To that extent, what we're going to argue in closing opposition is that I think that the distortionary response of abandoning a strategy of decapitation is far more likely to worsen conflicts and therefore incur a greater scale of harms than whatever OJ wants to talk about. Before I move on to my extension, I have two key pieces of framing that I think largely takes up closing government. Firstly, recognize that closing government largely runs an argument of opportunity cost. The question, which I think was rightly pointed out by Viha, is I'm not sure why is it that that case is necessarily mutually exclusive. This means that if they think that stories are important to humanize individuals, and that is important to de-radicalize individuals, presumably that's a strategy that we can take on in op as well. So I think that's the first key piece of framing. I don't think that their mechanism is unique. Second unique mechanism that they purported was that there is an opportunity cost, because if you focus on Baghdadi, you can't focus on the domestic threat of terrorism at home. Problematically, I'm not sure why the Navy SEALs who were tasked with taking out Osama, which was OG's model, is necessarily the same Navy SEALs that is needed to domestically protect you against terrorism. No thank you. Especially when terrorism is such an invisible threat. No thank you. What then is the upshot of the CG case? I think the upshot of the CG case is that it is either derivative of OG or the parts where are unique, I'm not sure are really unique to the extent that I don't think it's really mutually exclusive. To that extent, I want to move on to my extension that I think largely clashes with GovBench as an entity, and I will differentiate myself from opening opposition as well. What is the key piece of framing before I start my extension? I think the key piece of framing is that if we can show that GovBench worsens the conflicts, that GovBench actually increases boots on the ground, GovBench increases drone strikes, therefore they by virtue of that increase radicalism, and I think by virtue of that they increase the scale of civilian casualties. What therefore is the premise that we're going to argue? The premise we're going to argue is that when the leader is the icon of the movement, when the leader is intricately linked to the ideology, the decapitation of the leader is far easier to sell politically as a concrete win against that particular ideology. Viha points it out, but I don't think she explains to you why this is particularly important. The reason is because I suggest that absent of the decapitation strategy, and this is particularly important, politicians in the West still have natural incentives to win the war on terror, right? Because it's a key political issue. In Chin's words, it's a boon to your presidential career if you can be seen to win the war on terror. But second, the constant acts of terrorism have constantly led to public outrage, and therefore there are also good political incentives for you to crack down hard on the war of terror. But thirdly, with the rise of nationalistic leaders like Trump, you want to be seen to be tough on crime, to be tough on terrorists. What is the upshot? I think the upshot is that there are natural incentives posed by civilians for you to want to win the war on terror. What then is the problem, therefore? The problem is that when you cannot take out the leader, you cannot therefore concretely win the war on terror, right? Because you can't really defeat terrorism. Because what even is terrorism? Terrorism, in reality, is a very amorphous concept. What is the problem?
Sir?
The problem, no thank you, is that when you cannot take out the leader, you can't signal to your domestic population that you've concretely defeated terrorism. The problem is you still want to signal to your population that you've concretely defeated terrorism. No, thank you. And that is where the counterfactual is important. What then do you resort to? I suggest you resort to far more arcane means, like take out entire villages controlled by ISIS to prove they are concretely winning in the war on terror. You want to do things like killing as many foot soldiers as possible because on the optics, that is how you can show that you're winning the war on terror. But thirdly, no thank you, and I think this is the most important legacy of what abandoning decapitation has looked like. No thank you. I think that at a point which you can't sell to your domestic populations that we have made a concrete win on terrorism, it's far harder to convince your domestic populations to allow you to pull out of conflict zones like Afghanistan. That is why the Obama administration faced such a hard time trying to pull himself and American soldiers out of conflict zones. That is why America finds it so hard to stop the airstrikes in Syria. What therefore is the harm? No, thank you. The harm is threefold. Number one, greater civilian casualties. Number two, greater radicalization, which flips whatever OG talks about but worse. And this is what I do with what CEG talks about, right? At the point at which you can't concretely win the war on terror, not only do you use more extreme methods in foreign areas, I think you also use more extreme methods domestically. This means that, converse to what they say, there is going to be a far greater impetus to pass Islamophobic policies. Islamophobic policies like things like the burqa ban. Why is this particularly problematic? Because I think that the only way on their side of the house that they can ever win the war on terror is to show that they can be hard on minorities. This means that unlike what CG tells you, the alienation of minorities is going to be systemically exacerbated on our side, on their side of the house, at a point in which you can't sell to your domestic population that you can concretely win terrorism. No, thank you. The last thing that Chin says is, but there are natural incentives, right? Because the average Joe from the Bronx, his life matters, and therefore that is the political incentive to not go into those areas. Two responses. Firstly, that is incredibly unintuitive. No, thank you. American foot soldiers are often the poorest. They are often coerced by the American public into the military. The middle class and upper class cannot emotionally empathize with these individuals because they will never serve in the military anyway. That is why your average Joe from the Bronx is not going to affect the calculus of Trump in whether or not he decides to scale up the airstrikes or scale up boots on the ground. Before I move on to what then is the counterfactual we support, yes.
Okay, so you kill Osama, hurrah! Then another terror attack happens. Doesn't this incentivize the public to demand an orgy of drone strikes and decapitation, leading to a vicious cycle of further violence?
See, that argument is uncomparative, right? Because absent of our policy, that orgy of drone strikes exists anyway and is scaled up, right? Because at the point to which you can't tell your people that you defeat terrorism, that demand for orgy is only going to increase and further increase. What therefore is the counterfactual that we stand by? The counterfactual we stand by is that even if we can't really win terrorism, it is good in terms of the optics to sell to your domestic population that you win that war on terror. Why? Because I think this allows us to be able to pull out of conflict zones. This allows us to stop airstrikes in Syria because Baghdadi was killed. This allows us to tell people that because Osama was killed, it is important to then pull boots out of the ground. What is the solvency of this argument? The solvency of this argument is that at a point in which we are able to convince domestic populations to pull out of the conflict zones, that is when people will stop seeing American soldiers killing their families. That is how we actually decrease the radicalization that both sides really want. But most importantly, to the extent that Chen concedes we'll never win the war on terror, that there is no one correct strategy for the war on terror. Perhaps the best solution is to stop intervening. The best solution is to start pulling out your troops so that you can not cause further harm. But the only incentive to do so exists at a point at which you can sell it to your domestic population. We provide a mechanism for doing so. Happy to stand in closing our position.
Dear panel, I'm going to slightly suppress your headache of the circular debate that has existed so far by telling you and providing to you some clarity. OG says and admits that the leader is kept on a pedestal, that the leader is somebody who is a symbol of this particular cause that the terrorist organization wants to propagate. OO agrees. OG then says that this person is a leader whose death will strike a reward. But O says that said revolution will not happen because now these people have lost purpose and now that this cause is essentially going to die. We bring you the clarity of why targeting this leader right now is principally something that we should not do. why saving a life on the ground at this very point is something that becomes so important. Akin to saying that these people, no matter how many lives they may potentially take, no matter a probability of whether or not this might happen, we think that it is our responsibility as the state to save a life on the ground right now. Before I move on, some very important points of contention towards the CEO's case, right? They tell you and they talk to you about our opportunity cost, and this is basically what our argument is, right? The opportunity cost is like something that we consider, and they then tell you that these Navy SEALs who went to kill Osama bin Laden should not essentially care about or they were not affected by us killing other foot soldiers from these terrorist organizations. However, what we tell you is that there was a reason that these particular Navy SEALs knew where Osama bin Laden was in the first place, right? And that is when we characterized you that intelligence is such an important part of fighting terrorism, which is my defense to our extension in and of itself, right? When we tell you that this intelligence is something that is so important towards fighting the war on terrorism right now, no matter whether or not we win it, we think that we divert all of our resources and all of our intelligence, or most of our intelligence right now, when we consider fighting the leader of the terrorist organization as a strategy in and of itself. It then becomes so important here to note that these people who are being killed in other strikes, when we feel that this intelligence is something that is not essentially going to be made known to that terrorist organization because we are gaining on that particular leader, right? Here I bring you the example of Coventry, which we as the side closing government do not essentially support, right? We tell you that the state at this point in time has the priority and the incentive to protect its citizens who are going to die, because a terrorist organization will then know that these people, the state, knows that this attack is going to happen, which means they have infiltrated or intercepted the kind of communication that they are using, which means that these attacks which are happening right now are something that they will then use to in their favor by changing the way that they essentially make sure that they communicate, or by ensuring that they are able to become more meticulous or more invisible, as side closing opposition claims. We feel that this becomes a very, very important thing, right? Principally, the fact that I have to save this particular life right now is something that is very important, which is why we would also not support something like torturing this particular terrorist, right? We feel that at a point in time where we value like say 5 or like 50 human lives over like even one, this is a scaled down number right now, is something that is very, very wrong, because right now that is something that may or may not happen, but at this point in time I have the potential to save these lives, but I'm not doing that because of the fact that these people will then know that I am gaining onto them because I want to target their leader, right? As side opposition then concedes that yes, the entire Gov bench case is that although we are not, the entire Gov bench case is to counter the fact that this is a very important strategy to take out the leader, right? Which then means that we will be sidelining a lot of attacks that happen on the ground right now. That was our principal extension to you about the opportunity cost and why it matters so much. Before I go on, yes?
If it was country to country war, would you principally be against killing enemy soldiers?
What? But we kill people all the time in terms of like when we are against them in a fact where we want to protect our country from harm, right? However, I would protect my state's citizens as much as I can at this point in time. If those people from the other country are killing the citizens from my country, then I would obviously make sure that I kill them, because we feel that these states have the right to self-defense, which is absolute for their particular citizens in and of themselves, right? What that means is that, and this right to self-defense is something that we are going to exercise right now. The immediate fact that these people are going to die is something that we then feel is very, very important for us to then pursue, right? So we tell you then that they also talk to us about the fact that how the people on the ground will then suddenly believe on a superficial scale that we have completely defeated terrorism, which is why they will then accept to like being pulled out of Afghanistan or so on and so forth, right? We tell you that this is something that is very, very superficial on their side, because of the fact that they tell us that this is just, they literally say that this is a signal to the public when they talk to us about the fact that these are people who are that these are people who will just buy what the government is saying right now. Because I see a certain terrorist leader die, I don't go to myself, all right, now terrorism doesn't exist anymore. Now I can live a very peaceful life. Now I can essentially do whatever my state government tells me, because my state government is the best because they killed a particular terrorist leader. That is just not how this works. Terrorist leaders are in and of themselves tokenistic, which we on Closing Government also came and proved to you, right? We told you that you will always have someone, given the large bureaucratic systems that exist in place right now, you will always essentially have someone to replace this terrorist leader. Given that Side O then claims that the debate is about saying that whether or not we provide the policies that OG brings out to you, and that CG also slightly extends on the policies for these particular minorities, whether or not this would be beneficial to do it with the protection that the terrorist leader provides or without the protection, we say that that protection will always be existent, right? Because these leaders are continuously going to get substituted. These large organizations such as ISIS have things like administration, they have things like logistic teams, they have things like payrolls, and we tell you that such large bureaucratic systems can very easily replace the death of a leader who in and of himself is extremely tokenistic. And we feel that when they talk to us about, say, superficially trying to pull the wool over the eyes of the public as closing opposition, when they tell us that they are going to, say, somehow convince the public that the terrorism has essentially died, that is an argument that you should not buy, because even though we may or may not win the war on terrorism, it is in our moral duty to fight it in the best manner that we can, right? What that then means is that for us to essentially make sure that the rights of civilians right now and on the ground right now are safe is something that then becomes very, very important, right? Why I told you that we don't support a thing like commentary is because at that point in time, Alan Turing had no power to ensure that he is not essentially going to make sure that those people on that ship are not saved, right? Which means that we want to support the lives of civilians on the ground right now. And when I tell you, when I give you the premise that intelligence becomes so important as part of our essential to fighting terrorism, and it is at that point in time when we say that killing this leader would then mean not protecting your civilians right now, which is something that we as Closing Government strongly oppose, which is why we are extremely proud to propose it. Thank you.
There are three things I want to do in this speech. First, I want to tell you why CG is out of the debate. Second, I want to tell you why OG's argument and central piece of material about radicalism does not make sense. And lastly, I want to tell you about a counterfactual we built in Closing Opposition and why this defeats all the other teams in this debate. First, why is Closing Government out of this debate? Closing Government brings you two important pieces of material that is actually just quite derivative of OG. First, they tell you about the radicalism of people. Two things to note here. First, I think the radicalism of people, like to fight radicalism, I just don't think it's mutually exclusive. Like we can still run de-radicalization campaigns on our side of the house. So a lot of harms they talk about just does not exist. But second, insofar as their argument is opportunity cost, I think a lot of things they talk about fighting domestic terrorism are actually quite intricately linked to global terrorism as well. Insofar as many of these like domestic terrorist groups take inspiration from international terrorist groups, The question in this debate is who can defeat these international terrorist groups a lot better, which is a contingent point of OG. So insofar as that's the case, insofar as I can prove to you that we defeat these international groups way better, we take out OG later, and I'll explain to you and I'll flag it out when that happens. Then the second point about why opening government's points about radicalism just does not make sense. So insofar as we can show to you in Closing Opposition that their version of abandoning decapitation leads to worse conflicts, a lot of the harms are symmetrical on their side. So all the points of martyrdom are actually just a contingent hung point on worsening conflicts. So if we can show to you that conflict worsens more significantly on their side, then we tick above them in a rebuttal. So there are two reasons why that's the case. Firstly, Hanyang tells you about why, insofar as radicalism oftentimes is a byproduct of people hating and not being happy with the fact that intervention is happening in that country, insofar as we can show to you that we are more likely to pull countries out, we win on this clash. Why is that the case? Two reasons why. Hanyang tells you that there are natural incentives for governments to fight terrorism in and of themselves, because oftentimes these countries are naturally affected by terrorism, and also because of Chin's rhetoric about how Chin, he tells you that oftentimes there is a lot of political leverage and gain to get out of it. What does this mean at the point where there isn't a clear indicator, a clear metric, a clear marker of what a win against terrorism looks like? This often leads to two things. One, a lot more brutality in fighting terrorist groups, because oftentimes presidents and governments want to get a lot more leverage and a lot more political power out of saying we have defeated terrorism. This is where you actually lead to carpet bombing of Iraq, because we want to get out. We want to ensure that there is the ability to say there isn't a single terrorist on the ground because we have carpet bombed the entire city. I think that leads
leads to worsening conflict and worse, radicalism in these areas, because you're not only killing their leader, you're also killing their brothers and sisters. So I think like it's going to be far worse on side opening government. No thanks. But second, I think that what happens is that you lead to way more prolonged conflict as well. And what's the harm here? The problem with prolonged conflicts is that having boots on the ground often leads to a lot of tensions and leads to worsening and cementing of relations and tensions. And don't clap, because I think this is differentiated from opening opposition entirely, because their premise of their case is that they lead to splinter groups. We prove to you how we not only splinter these groups, but we are like the fact that you remain in these areas lead to way more radicalism, because people are just going to be way more discontented in and of themselves. What is the harm and what's the impact of proving this in this debate? Two things. One, we prove to you concretely that like opening government's arguments about how they lead to decreased radicalism is hung and contingent on worsening terrorism, and I can show to you how conflict can be far like not as bad. Yes.
So if you want to win this debate on withdrawal, then incentivizing a surge of anger-inspired terror attacks is precisely what makes it impossible to withdraw.
Okay, so I think on both sides of the house, if people, like you say, are going to be crazy fanatics, they are going to bomb people anyway. The question in this debate is, at the point where we kill the leader, what happens? I'll just give a little bit of credit here when they talk about splinter groups. But I think the crucial piece of analysis that Han Yang brings to you in this debate is that when you splinter these groups, the resources they have are going to be way and significantly less. Because it's no question in this debate that they are going to use their resources to carry out bombings. When we have 10 splinter groups on our side, I think they are going to carry out far less bombings, because the resources they have are just going to split up amongst all the splinter groups. This is differentiated from opening opposition, where they talk about infighting, because we prove to you concretely in terms of mechanisms how we beat opening government's argumentation about how you can lead to more bombings, because that doesn't happen. When you splinter the groups, you actually lead to less bombings because they have less ability to carry out this terrorist behavior. What is the counterfactual and what's the comparative, and why does closing opposition beat opening government in this exchange? Two reasons why. Firstly, Han Yang tells you a crucial piece of analysis about how at the point where we can concretely prove that we've defeated the terrorist groups, there's a lot more domestic support, and like it's going to be less like politically unpopular to pull troops out. What does this mean in terms of significant like benefits in terms of radicalization? Two things. One, you need to decrease tensions, but two, you also lead to less civilian deaths and casualties, which oftentimes leads to less radicalism in these areas. But second, you also lead to a decreased brutality in the way in which people like these leaders conduct their tactics against terrorism. Because note the counterfactual I've set up is that they're likely to carpet bomb, even if they are going to go into these areas and do drone strikes and some civilians die. I think the comparative you have to deal with is you're going to carpet bomb entire cities, because that is the only way you can prove your might against the terrorist groups. So that is the crucial distinction that I think opening government has to deal with. The last thing I want to talk about is this idea of martyrdom. So this idea of martyrdom, I think, is contingent on proving that there is radicalism to begin with. Insofar as you can prove to you that, like on our side, radicalism just doesn't happen. The last thing is this idea. Okay, so I think the last thing is a tension within the opening government's case, and Chinch attempts to resolve this, but I think it only hurts their case insofar as he attempts to resolve it. So if there is a clear chain of command, then I don't think that you need to splinter groups. And if there is a clear chain of command, okay, so I think opening opposition's response to that is that they explain that there is not going to be a clear chain of command and there'll be splinter groups and things like that. But I also want to prove to you that actually it is unlikely that they have a clear chain of command within these terrorist groups to begin with. The reason why is that oftentimes these leaders are quite egoistical. They believe in a concept beyond themselves and believe in ideology, and as a result, they are unlikely to have very clear chains of command and clear lineage in terms of passing down leadership. This means that at the point where we defeat the leader, it is quite likely that this is the real end of the terrorist group. And one good example here is Al-Qaeda, where Al-Qaeda never recovered to its original glory days at the point where it defeated Osama bin Laden. This is our crucial mechanism as to how, at the point where we defeat the terrorist leader, we are likely to defeat the terrorist group entirely. For these reasons,
Give me 5 minutes.
Turn off the record.
Yeah.